June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa begins. The German Wehrmacht surged across the Soviet border in a wave of summer heat and dust. The German High Command was operating on a schedule of arrogance. Adolf Hitler had declared, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." The planners in Berlin estimated the campaign would last 3 months. Maybe 4. They believed the Red Army would be destroyed west of the Dnieper River long before the first snowflake fell. This belief was so absolute that it dictated their logistics. The German quartermasters did not order winter uniforms. There were no parkas, no fur-lined boots, no white camouflage paint, no antifreeze for the vehicles. Why waste rail capacity on winter gear for a war that would be over in the summer? The German generals scoffed at the history books. They dismissed the story of Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812. "We are not Napoleon," they said. "We have tanks. We have engines. The weather cannot stop a mechanized army." They viewed the Russian winter as a myth, a ghost story used to scare children. They were men of science and industry. They believed that German engineering could conquer nature just as easily as it conquered nations. Through July and August, the sun beat down. The German soldiers marched shirtless, tanned and confident. They defeated Soviet army after Soviet army. They captured Minsk, Kiev, Smolensk. The dust was so thick it clogged their air filters. The heat was oppressive. In this environment, the idea of freezing to death seemed laughable. When logistical officers raised concerns about the coming autumn rains and winter cold, they were silenced. "Don't be a defeatist," the generals said. "We will be in warm billets in Moscow by Christmas." This was the summer mirage. It was a delusion shared by the entire German hierarchy. They believed they could dictate the timetable of the war. They looked at the map and saw only distances to be covered. They didn't see the climate zones. They didn't understand that Russia is not just a country, it is a continent with a weather system that is hostile to human life. As September turned to October, the days grew shorter. The sun lost its warmth. The German soldiers, still wearing their thin cotton summer tunics and jackboots with hobnails, felt the first chill in the air. They pulled their collars up. They joked about the Russian breeze. They didn't know that the mirage was fading. And behind the curtain of the autumn rain, a monster was waking up. A monster that had defeated every invader for 1,000 years. General Winter was coming, and the Wehrmacht was standing naked in his path. In October, the rains came. The Rasputitsa. The roads turned to mud. The German advance slowed to a crawl. But the German generals were actually relieved when the temperature started to drop in November. "Good," they said. "The ground will freeze. The tanks can move again." And the ground did freeze. The mud turned as hard as concrete. The panzers rolled forward again, pushing toward Moscow. But the temperature didn't stop dropping. It went to -10 degrees Celsius. Then -20 degrees Celsius. Then, in early December, a freak weather front hit western Russia. The mercury plummeted to -35 degrees Celsius, and in some places, -40 degrees Celsius. The German army, the most modern fighting force in the world, instantly ceased to function. This was the deep freeze. The German supply lines collapsed. Locomotives froze on the tracks because the water in their boilers turned to ice. Trucks broke down because the oil in their sumps turned into a sticky tar. But the most horrific impact was on the men. The German soldier was wearing a uniform designed for the temperate climate of France. It was made of a wool-rayon blend. It looked smart, but it had zero insulation. Underneath, he wore cotton underwear. On his feet, he wore the jackboot. This boot was a death trap. It had a tight fit, good for marching. It had metal hobnails on the sole, good for grip on grass. In -40 degrees Celsius, the metal hobnails conducted the cold straight from the ice into the soldier's foot. The tight leather constricted blood flow. Thousands of German soldiers suffered severe frostbite within days. Toes turned black and had to be amputated. Men stuffed newspapers into their jackets. They stole women's shawls from Russian villages and wrapped them around their heads. That master race looked like a ragtag army of beggars. Weapons began to fail. The German gun oil was not designed for extreme cold. It solidified. When a soldier tried to fire his Mauser rifle, the firing pin moved in slow motion. Click! No bang. Machine guns jammed. Artillery recoil mechanisms froze solid. The German commanders were stunned. They had planned for enemy resistance. They had planned for supply shortages. But they hadn't planned for their own technology to betray them. General Guderian reported that the telescopic sights on his tanks were useless because the glass fogged up and froze instantly. The German army was blind, immobile, and freezing to death. And they were still just a few miles from Moscow. They could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. But the distance might as well have been 1,000,000 miles. Because between them and the city, the temperature was dropping another 5 degrees. And out of the white mist, the Red Army was preparing to strike. While the Germans were freezing in their summer uniforms, Joseph Stalin played his ace card. For months, he had kept his best troops in the east, guarding the border against Japan. These were the Siberian divisions. These men were born in the snow. They were raised in the harshest climate on Earth. When Soviet spies confirmed that Japan would not attack, Stalin moved the Siberians west. They arrived at the Moscow front in November and December 1941. To the freezing German sentries, they looked like ghosts. They were dressed in full winter camouflage, white smocks and trousers that blended perfectly with the snow. Underneath, they wore the telegreka, a quilted, padded jacket and trousers filled with cotton wool. It was ugly. It was bulky. But it was incredibly warm. On their heads, they wore the ushanka, the thick fur hat with ear flaps. But the most important piece of kit was on their feet. The valenki. These were traditional Russian felt boots. Made of compressed wool, they had no soles, no laces, and no seams. They were clumsy to walk in, but they were impervious to cold. A soldier could stand in a snowbank for hours in valenki and his feet would stay warm. The arrival of the Siberians changed the psychology of the battle. The Germans were huddled in cellars, terrified of the cold, barely able to move. The Siberians were skiing. The Red Army deployed specialized ski battalions. These troops could move cross-country, ignoring the blocked roads. They moved silently. No engines. No footsteps. They would glide through the forests, bypassing the German strongpoints. German units would wake up in the middle of the night to find white ghosts inside their perimeter. The massacre would be swift. The Siberians used submachine guns, PP-41, which were lubricated with kerosene and didn't jam in the cold. They used knives. They used grenades. And then they would vanish back into the blizzard on their skis. The German commanders scoffed at the idea of ski troops in modern warfare. They thought it was a sport, not a military tactic. They realized too late that in deep snow, skis are faster than tanks. The Siberians brought a ferocity that terrified the Wehrmacht. These men were fresh. They were well fed. They were warm. They looked at the shivering, miserable Germans with contempt. For the first time in the war, the German soldier felt physically inferior to his enemy. He was a frozen statue. The Siberian was a hunter. And the hunt was on. The war on the Eastern Front was a war of machines. But in -40-degree weather, machines behaved differently. This is where the German over-engineering met its match against Soviet practicality. German tanks ran on gasoline, petrol. German trucks ran on gasoline. Gasoline engines are hard to start in the cold. The battery power drops. The oil thickens. Every morning, the German panzer crews faced a nightmare ritual. To start their tanks, they had to light fires. They would dig a hole under the engine compartment of the tank, fill it with wood soaked in gasoline, and light it. They had to heat the steel hull for an hour just to thaw the oil enough to turn the engine over. It was dangerous. Tanks caught fire. It was also a tactical disaster. If the Soviets attacked at dawn, the German tanks were useless. They were cold blocks of steel. The crews would be frantically trying to light fires while T-34 shells slammed into them. The Soviets, however, had the T-34. The T-34 ran on diesel. Diesel is less prone to exploding, but it can gel in the cold. However, the Soviets had developed a winter diesel mixture that stayed liquid. But the real genius was the starter system. The T-34 didn't rely solely on electric batteries, which lose their charge in the cold. It had a compressed air starter. The driver opened a valve. High-pressure air stored in tanks was injected directly into the cylinders. Hiss-boom. The engine would roar to life instantly. No fires. No waiting. While the Germans were thawing their tanks like frozen meat, the Soviet tanks were already moving. The Soviet designers had also designed the T-34 with generous tolerances. The parts fit together loosely. In the summer, this made the tank rattle and leak oil. But in the winter, it saved the tank. When metal gets cold, it contracts. The tight, precision-engineered German parts contracted and seized up. The gears ground to a halt. The loose Soviet parts contracted but still had room to move. The Tu-34 kept running. German commanders like Guderian watched in frustration. They saw their magnificent Panthers and Panzer IVs turned into static pillboxes by the frost. They saw the T-34s maneuvering freely across the snow. They realized that they had built race cars for a track that didn't exist. The Soviets had built tractors for the reality of Russia. The Ten-Jin War was won not by horsepower, but by the ability to simply start the ignition. And in the freezing dawn of December 1941, that was the only advantage that mattered. In the end, the battle for Moscow didn't come down to tanks or artillery. It came down to boots. The German Marschstiefel, the jackboot, was a symbol of Prussian militarism. It was tall, black leather. It was stiff. It had metal hobnails hammered into the sole for grip. It looked magnificent on a parade ground in Berlin. In the Russian snow at -35°C, it was a death sentence. The leather froze hard as iron. It constricted the blood flow to the feet. The metal hobnails acted as conductors. They sucked the freezing temperature right out of the ice and injected it directly into the soldiers' souls. A German sentry standing still for 2 hours would lose all feeling in his feet. When he tried to take his boots off, the skin would sometimes peel away with the frozen sock. Gangrene set in quickly. The German field hospitals were overwhelmed with thousands of cases of severe frostbite. Amputations became routine. The German army was literally being crippled by its own footwear. On the other side of the line, the Soviet soldier wore something that looked ridiculous to the German eye. The Valenki. These were traditional Russian peasant boots. They were not made of leather. They were made of thick, felted sheep's wool. They had no laces. No seams to let in the cold. No metal parts. They were clumsy. You couldn't march smartly in them. But they were incredibly warm. The thick wool trapped air, creating perfect insulation. A Soviet soldier could stand up to his knees in snow for hours, waiting for an ambush, and his feet would remain dry and warm. The contrast was stark. The supermen of the Wehrmacht were hobbling around with rags wrapped around their frozen feet, crying from the pain. The subhuman Soviets were comfortable. German officers began to realize a terrifying truth. Their superior technology, their superior culture, their superior planning had failed to produce something as essential as a warm boot. They had scoffed at the primitive Russians. But the primitive Valenki was saving lives, while the advanced jackboot was taking them. The Soviets had the ultimate home field advantage. They knew how to dress for the weather. While the German soldiers froze, their weapons froze with them. The German military was obsessive about maintenance. They had specialized oils for everything. But their standard weapon lubricant, Waffenol, had a fatal flaw. It was not designed for extreme polar temperatures. When the thermometer hit -30°C, the oil stopped being a lubricant. It became glue. The precision engineering of German weapons became their downfall. The tolerances on a Mauser 98K rifle or an milligram 34 machine gun were very tight. When the oil solidified into a sticky paste inside the firing mechanism, the weapon jammed. Imagine the terror of a German infantryman. A wave of Soviet ski troops is attacking out of the blizzard. He aims his rifle. He pulls the trigger. Instead of a sharp crack, there is a sluggish click. The firing pin moves too slowly to ignite the primer. He frantically tries to work the bolt, but it's frozen shut. The machine gunners fared no better. The milligram 34 was a magnificent weapon in the summer. In the winter, if it wasn't stripped of all oil and run completely dry, it wouldn't fire more than a single shot. The artillery was affected too. The recoil mechanisms of the big guns were filled with hydraulic fluid. The fluid froze. If they fired the gun, the recoil system would shatter, destroying the weapon. The German army was effectively disarmed by the cold. The Soviets, once again, had a crude but effective solution. They didn't use high-grade weapon oil in the winter. They used a mixture of thin mineral oil and kerosene. Or sometimes, just gasoline. It didn't provide great lubrication for the long term. It caused wear and tear on the weapons. But it didn't freeze. The Soviet PP-41 submachine gun had loose tolerances and a powerful return spring. It chewed through ammunition even in the deepest freeze. German reports from this period are full of despair. "Our weapons remain silent," one officer wrote, while the Russians fire seemingly without interruption. The Germans were the masters of technology, yet they were being beaten because they didn't have the right kind of grease. It was a logistical failure of epic proportions, brought about by the arrogant belief that the war would be over before winter arrived. The German generals were proponents of modern, mechanized warfare. They viewed horse cavalry as an obsolete relic of the 19th century. When they saw intelligence reports that the Red Army was deploying large numbers of Cossack cavalry divisions, they laughed. Horses against panzers, they scoffed. It will be a slaughter. But they were thinking about summer warfare. In the winter of 1941, the snow on the Russian steppes was 3 feet deep. Wheeled vehicles were useless. They were instantly bogged down. Even tanks struggled, their bellies dragging in the deep drifts, consuming massive amounts of fuel just to move at a walking pace. The German mechanized army was paralyzed. It was stuck on the few cleared roads, creating massive traffic jams that were easy targets for Soviet bombers. But the Cossack horse could move. The hardy steppe horses of the Red Army were used to the climate. They didn't need gasoline. They could forage for grass under the snow. They didn't freeze up like engines. And they could move through deep snow across open country, bypassing the road network entirely. The Cossacks became the masters of the winter envelopment. While the Germans were huddled around stoves in fortified villages, terrified of the cold outside, thousands of Cossack horsemen were riding silently through the blizzards around their flanks. They struck deep in the German rear. They attacked supply depots. They cut telegraph wires. They ambushed headquarters staff. The psychological impact was devastating. The Germans felt safe behind their front lines. Suddenly, out of the swirling whiteout, a regiment of saber-wielding horsemen would charge into their supply base. It was terrified chaos. Frozen German infantry tried to fight back with jamming rifles against a charging wall of horseflesh and steel. The Cossacks used the weather as a weapon. They attacked during the worst storms, knowing the Germans would be taking shelter and their guard would be down. General Zhukov used the cavalry brilliantly. He used them to plug gaps in the line, to raid, and to pursue the retreating enemy. The Germans realized too late that mobility isn't just about engines. Mobility is about adapting to the terrain. In the deep snow of Russia, the obsolete horse was superior to the modern truck. The Germans had laughed at the cavalry, but they stopped laughing when they found themselves surrounded by them. By the first week of December 1941, the German offensive on Moscow had ground to a halt. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, frozen, and stretched to the breaking point. Their leading units were just 20 miles from the Kremlin. They were so close, yet completely incapable of moving another inch. They dug in, hoping to survive the winter and resume the attack in the spring. They assumed the Red Army was in the same condition. German intelligence reported that Stalin had no reserves left. They were wrong. On December 5, 1941, General Georgy Zhukov unleashed the Soviet winter counter-offensive. It was a massive hammer blow. 17 Soviet armies, including the fresh Siberian divisions, smashed into the frozen German lines along a 500-mile front. The Germans were completely caught off guard. It wasn't just an attack, it was a demonstration of winter warfare doctrine. The T-34s, started instantly with compressed air, led the charge, their wide tracks painted white to match the snow. The Siberian infantry on skis glided through the forests, bypassing the German strongpoints and attacking them from the rear. The Cossack cavalry swept around the flanks, cutting off escape routes. The German defense collapsed. Because their vehicles wouldn't start, the Germans couldn't maneuver to meet the threats. Their tanks were static pillboxes. Their artillery couldn't be moved. When a German unit was outflanked, it couldn't retreat fast enough. Panic set in. For the first time in World War II, the mighty Wehrmacht was on the run. It was a ghastly retreat. German soldiers abandoned their frozen equipment. Roads were littered with hundreds of tanks, thousands of trucks, and artillery pieces that had been abandoned because they had no fuel or wouldn't run. The retreat became a death march. Soldiers who fell behind froze to death in the snow. Soviet partisan units, emboldened by the offensive, ambushed the retreating columns. Hitler, furious, issued his famous halt order. He forbade any retreat. This order likely saved the German army from total annihilation, forcing them to stand and fight, but it came at a horrific cost in lives. By January 1942, the Red Army had pushed the Germans back nearly 250 kilometers from Moscow. The threat to the capital was over. The myth of German invincibility was shattered forever. The world saw that the Nazi war machine could be stopped. It could be beaten. The German commanders who had scoffed at the Russian winter were now presiding over an army wrecked by it. They had learned a brutal lesson: in Russia, you don't just fight the enemy. You fight the environment. And if you don't respect General Winter, he will destroy you before the first bullet is even fired. As the German trucks lay buried under snowdrifts, turning into white mounds of useless steel, the Red Army unleashed a logistical weapon that the German High Command had laughed at for years. The Panzer sled. The Germans were obsessed with motorization. They believed that supplies should be moved by engines. But in 4 feet of snow, engines don't work. Wheels spin. Chassis bottom out. The Soviets knew this. While their tanks were modern, their rear echelon logistics were medieval and perfectly suited for the environment. They mobilized hundreds of thousands of Panzer ponies. These were small, shaggy horses native to Eastern Europe. They were ugly, stubborn, and incredibly tough. They could survive on pine needles and frozen grass. They didn't need heated stables. And they pulled sleds. Simple, wooden sleds on runners. While a German Opel Blitz truck carrying 3 tons of ammo would get stuck 10 feet out of the depot, a convoy of 50 sleds could move that same ammo across open fields, through forests, and over frozen rivers. The Germans watched with a mix of envy and horror. Their own logistics had collapsed. The railheads were clogged with trains that couldn't move. The road network was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles. German soldiers at the front were starving. They were rationing bullets. Meanwhile, the Soviet frontline troops were receiving hot food, vodka, and endless ammunition. It was delivered by a transport system that required no gasoline and no spare parts. The Soviets built specialized sleds for everything. They had sleds for artillery shells, sleds for wounded men. They even put their heavy machine guns, the Maxim gun, and mortars on sleds, allowing the infantry to drag their heavy weapons with them as they advanced on skis. The Germans, stuck in their static positions, were immobile. The Soviets were fluid. The primitive nature of the Soviet logistics became their greatest strength. It was a triumph of adaptation over technology. The German generals had mocked the backwardness of the Russian peasant economy. But that economy was keeping the Red Army alive, while the advanced German industrial machine was freezing to death. The Panzer sled proved that in the extremes of nature, low-tech often beats high-tech. The lifeline of the Soviet counteroffensive wasn't an autobahn, it was a track in the snow, beaten down by the hooves of 1,000,000 ponies. The physical effects of the cold were terrible: frostbite, hypothermia, gangrene. But the psychological effects were even worse. The White Death began to erode the minds of the German soldiers. In the sub-zero temperatures of the Moscow front, a strange apathy settled over the Wehrmacht. Medical officers reported that soldiers would simply stop moving. They would sit down in the snow, overcome by a lethal drowsiness. They stopped caring about the war. They stopped caring about survival. When ordered to stand guard, they would drift into a stupor. The cold stripped away their discipline. The proud soldiers of 1940, who kept their uniforms spotless, turned into scavengers. They began to strip the bodies of the dead. When a Soviet soldier was killed, German troops would risk their lives to crawl out and steal his boots, the Valenki. They stripped the dead Russians of their quilted jackets. Soon, the German front line looked like a ragged band of partisans. Officers lost control. Men refused orders to attack, simply stating, "It is too cold." The fear of the night became paralyzing. In the summer, the German soldier felt superior. He owned the battlefield. In the winter night, huddled in a freezing dugout, listening to the wind howl, he felt small. He felt abandoned by his leaders in Berlin. He knew that Hitler was sitting in a warm bunker. He knew the generals had heated quarters. But he was left to die in a hole in the ground. This resentment broke the fighting spirit of the army. Suicide rates spiked. Soldiers would walk away from their posts into the blizzard, preferring to freeze to death rather than endure another night of shivering. The master race ideology crumbled when faced with the indifference of nature. The cold didn't care about Aryan supremacy. It killed everyone equally. But the Russians seemed immune to the psychological terror. They were fighting on their home soil. They knew this weather. They respected it, but they didn't fear it. To the German soldier, the Russian winter wasn't just weather, it was a malevolent force, a supernatural enemy that was slowly squeezing the life out of them. And as the temperature dropped, so did their will to win. As the front collapsed, Hitler issued his famous Halt order. He forbade any retreat. he ordered the German army to form Hedgehogs, Eigelstellungen. The idea was to hold key villages and road junctions, turning them into all-around defensive fortresses. The troops were to hunker down inside these villages, creating islands of resistance in a sea of snow. Hitler believed that if they held the roads, the Soviets couldn't advance. It was a strategy born of desperation, and it was flawed. The Soviet doctrine had changed. The Red Army didn't care about the roads. Using their skis, their T-34s, and their sleds, they simply bypassed the hedgehogs. They flowed around the German strongpoints like water around rocks. The German garrisons inside the villages felt secure at first. They had warmth. They had walls. But soon they realized they were trapped. The Soviets cut the supply lines between the villages. The hedgehogs became prisons. Then, the attacks began. The Soviets didn't attack the fortified perimeter head-on. They attacked at night. The White Ghosts, the Siberian ski troops, would infiltrate the gaps between the bunkers. They would crawl through the snow, invisible in their camouflage. Suddenly, a German soldier warming his hands by a stove would hear a grenade roll down the chimney. Panic would ensue. The Soviets would overrun a section of the village, set fire to the houses, and force the Germans out into the freezing night. A German soldier without a house in -35°C weather is a dead man. The hedgehog strategy turned into a series of isolated disasters. Garrison after garrison was surrounded, starved, and annihilated. The Luftwaffe tried to supply them by air, but the weather was too bad. The German commanders watched their maps as the red tide swallowed their islands of resistance one by one. The strategy relied on the enemy acting conventionally. But the Red Army was fighting a three-dimensional war of movement in terrain the Germans considered impassable. The hedgehogs didn't stop the Soviet advance, they just provided convenient places for the Red Army to destroy the Wehrmacht piece by piece. In the spring of 1942, the sun finally returned to Russia. The Rasputitsa returned. The snow melted. And as the white blanket receded, it revealed the full horror of the Winter War. The landscape was littered with the wreckage of the German army. Thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, abandoned and rusted, emerged from the drifts. But the most grisly sight was the bodies. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, preserved perfectly by the ice, lay where they had fallen. Some were huddled in foxholes, rifles still in their hands. Some were found in columns, frozen mid-march. It was a graveyard that stretched from Moscow almost to Poland. The Wehrmacht never fully recovered from the winter of 1941. They had lost their best men. The veteran NCOs, the trained specialists, the flower of the German army had perished in the snow. They had lost their equipment. The massive losses of tanks and trucks could never be fully replaced by German industry. But most importantly, they had lost their aura of invincibility. The world had seen the German army broken, freezing, and running. The Soviet victory at Moscow proved that the Blitzkrieg could be stopped. It proved that technology has limits. The German commanders who had scoffed at the primitive Russians learned a bitter lesson. They learned that war is not just about ballistics and armor thickness. It is about logistics. It is about clothing. It is about psychology. It is about respecting the environment you are fighting in. The Tu-34 with its wide tracks, the Siberian with his felt boots, and the pony with his sled had defeated the Panzer, the jackboot, and the truck. General Winter had exacted a heavy toll on the arrogance of the Third Reich. The legacy of that winter hung over the German army for the rest of the war. Every time the leaves started to fall in autumn, a collective shiver went through the ranks of the Wehrmacht. They remembered the white hell. And they knew that in Russia, the snow doesn't just cover the ground. It covers the dead,